Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I'm here with Phil Melanson, the author of FLORENZER, a book about one of my favorite and kind of like one of the people I like thinking about most in all of human history, Leonardo da Vinci. So I just like am so thrilled, A, that this book exists, and B, that the man himself is here to talk about it. I can't wait to come at Leonardo from like every non-Dan Brown angle that that I want. A few words about The Thoughtful Bro before we get started. We are live streaming on a Mighty Blaze on Facebook and YouTube. The Thoughtful Bro is here as always to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. We've been here for, about 6 years now, connecting writers and readers virtually. We're an all-volunteer initiative, and we are never asking for your money except during the occasional biannual fundraiser. If you want to show us the love, really, just like us on social media and follow us and repost us and tell your friends about us. And if you really want to spend some money, though, if you are in the mood for that, I would suggest you open up a new browser tab and purchase a copy of FLORENZER. It is a book about the real life and kind of like all the stuff you haven't really heard, but you might have imagined. Well, Phil vividly and meticulously imagines it for you in this book. The book, again, is called FLORENZER, and we have a partnership with bookshop.org, as everybody knows. Please go there, support indie bookstores, and buy a copy for this and all your Leonardo-loving friends. So we'll put a link to buy that in the chat. And regarding questions, you just put them in the chat, and we'll make our way to those at the end. And now a little bit more about Phil Melanson. He is a graduate of NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and the University of Warwick. Prior to writing FLORENZER, he was a digital marketer, and we're going to talk about this later, for Hollywood film studios, working on campaigns for movies such as Little Women, Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He now lives in London with his husband. His debut novel is FLORENZER. It just came out last month. It is a richly detailed, meticulously researched, vivid portrait of the streets of 15th century Florence. It explores the secret life of one of the great artists and thinkers to ever live, Leonardo da Vinci. Arsén, author of Shoot the Moon, called it, quote, a dazzling parable of ambition, greed, and wealth. Phil Melanson, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh my God, all the way from London. The last time I had somebody from London was actually Maggie O'Farrell talking about Hamnet, which I think is a comp for this book. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I certainly, I think Hamnet came out as I was in the revision process for FLORENZER. And I think there are so many similarities in how we approached writing about very famous men, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, definitely two of the great geniuses ever. And I think that's a great comp. I think it really shed light on, it's sort of like their personal life, their kind of like the way that kind of their own, I don't know. It does the best things that historical fiction can do, which is like gives you insight into the art and how it connects the art to the personal lives of the man. So I loved both of these books. But let me just ask you first, before we go any further, this is your first book. Now it has been about a month since it came out, or a little bit more than a month, I think. Just tell us, how has it been?
It's been great. It's a very bizarre and unique process getting a book out into the world where you are finding a new sense of excitement for something that has been a part of your life for 5+ years. But I think the joy of the past month has been getting to chat with people like you, getting to chat with readers, with booksellers around the country. I just came back from a month in the States promoting the book, and it's just so exciting to see people's organic reactions to the book rather than having it live, Leonardo live in my head for the past 5+ years.
I'm putting you on the spot, but give me like an example of like an organic, as you say, reaction that somebody had that struck you.
Oh boy. I think you were there for this at the Boston event, but one of the, fantastic booksellers at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass. He, mentioned that he's a, art history buff, if you will. And he just spoke about how much he appreciated my approach to writing about Leonardo. And going back to the Maggie O'Farrell angle, I think it's always about I like when historical fiction approaches these figures from perhaps an oblique angle. And I think, he had that appreciation for that, which was really lovely. Hasn't worn off yet.
Oh, that guy was great. That was a great event. It
It
really
was. I
was.
mean, I shouldn't, it was a really strong one. I shouldn't say it was my favorite, but it was my favorite.
Yeah, for those who weren't there, who are listening, I actually interviewed Phil at that event, and that meant a lot to me too, because I mean that was the event that had all your family there and kind of like some of your hometown folks. So that was really cool. So I want to just jump right into Leonardo, as I always do. I mean, I remember back, I don't know how old I was, maybe around like 20 years old, sort of like right when I was getting out of college. I just had this huge, beautiful Leonardo book, and I would just spend afternoons just looking through that thing. I mean, I love Leonardo so much, and I just feel like he is, they always say about great art, when you revisit it, you always find something new, and that's how it is for me and his paintings. I mean, you keep looking and you keep finding new things. I guess just the most obvious question to start with is how did you choose this topic? Like, why Leonardo for you?
Reluctantly is how I chose Leonardo. I will say I had some trepidation, and I think well-warranted trepidation
Mm,
over writing, fictionalizing perhaps like one of the most famous figures in all of history. And, you know, I will say I began with the setting before the particular characters that were involved
mm,
in the story. So I knew I wanted to write about Florence during the Renaissance, and I knew I wanted to write about this relationship between art and commerce. I knew I had to have Lorenzo de' Medici in there as a part of that,
mhm,
as a figure of power and as someone who was commissioning art and a very influential figure in the development of the Renaissance. But then I looked at Botticelli, I looked at Perugino, I looked at so many different artists, but there were more questions with Leonardo. There were more
mm,
gaps, which was so surprising to me, given that how documented he is. There is a remarkable gap in terms of the scholarship about his adolescence and his artistic coming of age. Much of what is written about him really focuses on the period once he's in Milan, which is well into his 30s. And
right.
so there were questions there, and I think for this, for the historical novelist, I think it's the gaps, it's the ambiguities, it's the conflicting explanations that really is the fountain of probably good fiction.
I remember from the last time I interviewed you, you brought up a kind of comment in passing about Botticelli, and you said one thing about Botticelli is that and I didn't know this, but he sort of was an instant success and was sort of like instantly in demand, and Leonardo had sort of like a longer, more winding road. And I think that, I don't know, I just instantly gravitate towards any story of like some monumental genius who just like took a long time to be recognized, and like it wasn't just handed to them at first. I mean, I think you can probably relate, almost every artist can relate to feeling like, why is it taking so long for me? Like it
Mhm.
seems so easy for other people, and then you hear like, oh, maybe Leonardo wasn't just an insta hit. You're like, okay, see, other people also struggle to get a foothold.
Absolutely. And I think the interesting thing with Botticelli in that regard was, he was lauded from a very early age. And certainly Leonardo's talents were commented about, while he was an apprentice and as he moved on from his apprenticeship. But, for many complicated reasons that I may explore in the novel, I was very fascinated with like what is stopping this artist from making, or in many times from finishing his work.
Right. Oh, and I do want to get into that, in kind of the mystery and the kind of particular nature of his restless way of thinking, and why that might have slowed him down in finishing some things. But before we get to that, I mean, I think another reason why you wrote this book, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel strongly that this is the case, is that you feel like there was an aspect of Leonardo's life that has like not really been discussed, and it's not really in the history books, and one might even say has been repressed, and that is that he is almost certainly, or was gay.
Mhm.
Can you just talk about like why was that a part, or was that a part of why you wanted to write the book, and if so, why?
Something that came up in my research was the fact that Renaissance Florence was, a magnet for what today we would call queer or gay men. Contemporary accounts are quite vivid in how they describe the period of men cruising for sex, men having sex out in the public, by the river, even in the churches. It's nuts what you read from the time period.
Wow.
That is purportedly true.
Yeah.
And where it all came together for me, and I think really where the novel unlocked itself for me in the writing process, was discovering that Leonardo himself is twice accused of sodomy, in his late 20s, in 1476. And, there's a lot we don't know about this accusation, but it really brought together several important parts of the novel for me. And it really made me wonder why I was only just learning about this aspect of his personal life in my late 20s at that point, rather than, the biographies I had, read about him ad nauseum, when I was, in high school and even in university. And the more you begin to look at it, the more, to borrow your phrasing, you do see like a certain repression of the record there. You see some academic reluctance to labeling him. And I understand the ideology behind that our modern day conception of homosexuality, the word homosexual didn't exist in 1476. Gay didn't exist in 1476. But certainly there were people with these desires, urges, differences, essential differences, alive throughout history. And yet there has been this somewhat perhaps suspicious reluctance to discuss this as a part of Leonardo's story. And I think when you consider that and then you look at some of his art, you really can't unsee the connection between those things, I would personally argue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and I want to hear you say more about it. But I mean, one thing that comes through in the book is like his feeling of, being an outsider. He's somebody who, he knows that he is gay, even though he kind of doesn't say it in quite that way. But he knows there's this part of him that he can't change. He is this way. He's also a bastard son, and he kind of has a conflict with his father. And so there's this way that painting is this avenue for him to kind of, I think the book says something along the lines of like walk among great people, and be an important person of his age. But I mean, I'm just, do you feel like is it a fruitful avenue to go down to kind of say like, hey, let's kind of take a step back and look at how this aspect of who he is might have influenced what his art was, and he might not have been the same kind of artist or have like made art in the same way had he not been gay?
Absolutely. I think you said it perfectly there, where, I think this is the real privilege of the novel, in contrast to traditional history writing, where, I'm allowed to imagine, to render, and build upon the historical record, certainly. But that was where I felt the real rush to write this novel, was considering the idea of inspiration and also its opposite side, which was what sometimes stopped him. What were the blocks that were preventing him from finishing work? And as you said, certainly his status, I think, is a part of that. And yes, it could be his status about having an attraction, a desire for other men. But as you said as well, it's equally valid that he was a bastard. That did carry a certain, I guess, significance to it during the Renaissance. And it also brings up interesting dynamics with his relationship with his father, who was a notary in Florence during his lifetime. And the interesting note that the book does get into, as you know, is, his father does have the ability to essentially legitimize his son. And whether he chooses to do that or not is one of these interesting questions that drove me to imagine the emotional experience of these decisions, and I think that's the realm of the novel.
Yeah. It's so great. It's just so great, because I just think like it's so overwhelming, the quality and amount of work that Leonardo, especially through his notebooks, that's where you get most of his work. I mean, there's just so much, and it's so varied, and it's so different than the body of work of anybody else who's ever lived. And it's just, you can get caught on the surface, or you can get caught in the work and not just think, he was a person who woke up in the morning and ate breakfast and like wanted to be loved, and had things he was afraid of and things like that. It's just I almost am like, why haven't there been like a dozen books about Leonardo's life? I mean, it's right.
I was shocked. I was like, how have there not been more? I really
Right.
feel like I'm going for an obvious target here.
Right.
But hey, I'm grateful that there hasn't been, because it allowed me to feel free to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about Da Vinci and kind of what to me makes him so interesting and special. And obviously I want to hear, what you think of this, and also kind of what makes him so special to you. But like, to me, the thing is that I just feel like he had some more grand project than merely art. I mean, you mentioned earlier, like, why did he have such trouble kind of like finishing his works, and why are there so few of them? I think I saw some number, like there's something like 25 or 26 or so like paintings of Leonardo that are definitely his. And so why aren't there tons more? I mean, he clearly could have made so much money. He was influential. He was famous at the time. Why ambivalence, I think, is the word that I would use to describe his attitude towards his art. And to me, it's like, I think what it was that he just had this big project that he was kind of trying to solve. He was trying to kind of like get in the mind of God almost as an engineer. And it's like, he wanted to, it wasn't enough to just like paint beautiful hair that looked like, flowing rivulets in a stream, right? He wanted to understand, he wanted to like then draw the stream and understand, how does the stream work? And like, can I build something that makes energy from the stream, or like a boat that will like become a tool for the Navy in the stream. He just kind of wanted to just always go deeper and deeper and deeper. And it was interesting, like George Lucas, the filmmaker, he is a very engineering focused guy. And I know that he made Star Wars and he directed like the first film, but then he hated directing. He just didn't like dealing with actors. He was more of an engineer. And he always said, film is an engineering problem, like making a film. I mean, not every director or actor or writer would say that. I think that is kind of a very interesting thing about George Lucas. And that's why he's made, he has a huge company that, makes special effects for films. That's like his angle. But I feel like Leonardo is like of that engineering mindset. And he was just sort of almost feel like he was on this quest to understand what is like the single law of nature, or the thing that like binds it all together, the unified field theorem, if you will. And anyway, that's a very long way of saying that I just feel like the fact that he was an artist was probably not the most important thing about him. It was sort of a means to an end for him, or it was like a sort of a byproduct of kind of the bigger thing that he was trying to do, which is kind of understand the mysteries of the universe. So
Yes.
what do you think about all that?
I think you're entirely right. I think if we could ask Leonardo right now, he would not self-describe himself as a painter. He was many things. And that essential but conflicting part of his identity was something that I was curious in exploring. And I think you're right. It does explain why he left so many paintings, so many works unfinished. I think your anecdote about the waves of hair and the rivulets, he is fascinated with spirals. That's something that becomes quickly apparent when you look at his notebooks. You're right. It's like that was what I imagine his mind was doing, was jumping from how do I draw, authentically draw this strand of hair, to like, it's like a stream, but why is the water moving in this particular way? And, how can we engineer this? And I'm always reluctant to throw around the adjective genius or the noun genius, but I do think he was singular, and he warrants that title because of the way he made these connections. And I think part of the exciting part for me, and maybe fun's not the right word, but where I felt a little emboldened, I guess, to write a fictionalization of his early life, was because these threads are just starting to come together for him. This is, they we are seeing the seeds of the polymath that he becomes.
Mm.
But also considering like that tension of his early career where he did train in a an artist's workshop. And so he did not have this, traditional Latin education. He didn't have a traditional engineering education. And one of the fascinating things that the novel allowed me to consider was like, how does he feel about that? Does he have regret over going down the painting route, if you will? Did he want to make a career pivot? That is a fascinating dynamic to consider.
When you think of him as this great thinker, as you say, a genius, what is to you the singular quality that stands out? What's like the most interesting thing about him that makes him stand out?
I think it is the unusual connection between disparate things. It is what we were just describing about going from a strand of hair to the way that water eddies in the Arno River. It is making unexpected connections, which are often proven correct by our science today. And it's, I think, that insatiable curiosity of always wanting to understand, to comprehend.
Yeah. I sometimes think about, I think Americans really like Leonardo, and it's interesting. Like over time, if you think about how like the reputation of certain geniuses go up and down, like Shakespeare, I think in like the 1800s was like not nearly as famous as he is now, and he was sort of like revived by Goethe and like some German critics in the 1800s, but he had sort of was on his way to being far less relevant. And now, I mean, Shakespeare is just kind of the most famous writer ever. But so there's an ebb and flow to these kind of things. And I just, this is a pet theory of mine, but I wonder if like, there's something in the practicality of Leonardo. I mean, it's funny to call him practical, a guy who could like never finish anything. And but like the way that his mind was an engineer's mind. I mean, like who are like the kind of culture heroes of America right now? I mean, it's like, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. No matter what you think about Elon Musk, the reason why he's famous is because he's an engineer, and these people who are solving kind of practical business problems. I mean, I just feel like if Leonardo lived today, I mean, he would have. I mean, Apple probably would have hired him immediately, right? I mean, just for that way of thinking. And I just wonder if there's something about him, as opposed to being like a quote mere artist, that might make him kind of more interesting to a kind of more American mindset, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really compelling argument. And I do think that if Leonardo were today, he, for better, but maybe for worse, would be in Silicon Valley. Hopefully not, focusing too hard on AI. But what I would say, and I think this is actually the parallel to Silicon Valley, I think is entirely valid. And that is one of the reasons that I was drawn to writing about the Renaissance, was it does have these parallels, but from the 1400s to today. And one of them is people's work being contingent on commissions, on payment, on patronage. And to a degree, I mean, we see that today, but in the tech world, perhaps in fashion, certainly with filmmaking. And so it really is interesting to consider how Leonardo would have navigated that terrain in today's environment, which, yes, we're very much in the capitalist stage right now, or late stage capitalism, and that wasn't the case during the Renaissance, but he probably would have been quite adept at navigating it in the way that, because of these parallels, perhaps, to his own time.
Yeah. All right. So I want to talk about a film that came out a few years ago, which I found to be utterly compelling. And I think just objectively, one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen. It's called The Lost Leonardo. And so for those who haven't seen this film, I could not give it a higher recommendation. It is basically like a thriller, but it's a documentary, and it's just a fascinating documentary. It's about this painting called Salvator Mundi, which was purchased like many years ago, like I don't know how many years ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago, purchased in New Orleans for $1,100, like $1,100 at some random art auction in New Orleans. that painting was then brought to New York, and some experts looked at it and they thought, well, this might not just be the run-of-the-mill, 500-year-old painting. This might have come from Leonardo's workshop. It might have come from Leonardo himself. And then the painting gets retouched and it looks more like a Leonardo. And then it sells for $80 million. And then in turn, it sells for like 120. Then it sells for 450. And in the end, it's the most expensive painting ever sold. And there is huge disputes that remain to this day about whether it's an actual Leonardo or if this whole thing is just a fraud. It's actually owned by Mohammed bin Salman, or the head of Saudi Arabia. I don't know if that's exactly his name, but MBS. He's the one who paid that $450 million. And I think right now nobody has seen that painting in years. Okay, anyway, so that's my quick summary of the film. But so before we get any further, let me just say, Phil, have you seen that film and what do you think of it?
Yes, I mean, I think you did a excellent pitch for that documentary. I would like to give some love as well to Ken Burns's Leonardo documentary that came out, I believe, a year ago. Which, to Ken Burns's credit, is also one that has rarely commented, one of the few pieces that has commented on Leonardo's sexuality. So I appreciated that. But this Lost Leonardo mess, let's call it, excellent documentary, messy situation. It's fascinating to me. This is where I am so glad that the Salvator Mundi, as it's being called, is not in the purview of the novel I wrote. That painting is thought to have been made much later in Leonardo's career, and I was so glad I didn't have to work out my answer as to whether Leonardo painted it or not, or take a stand within the realm of the novel, because it is thorny.
And well, so let's work it out on this podcast. Is it a real Leonardo, Phil?
I am not an art historian, is my major caveat, and that was coming from a non-art historian perspective was, I think, a really lovely way to approach writing about Leonardo as a novelist. But as a unqualified non-art historian, but Leonardo, let's go with aficionado, I would say it doesn't feel like a Leonardo to me. But that is a emotional answer, maybe not a answer based on hard evidence, although I think you can argue the evidence one way or another, which is how you end up writing a documentary about this.
I mean, to me, I don't believe it's Leonardo. I mean, maybe he painted a little bit of it. I mean, but even that just seems like I just doubt it. I think it's just totally a situation where it's people want it to be the truth so badly. And it's just the same way if somebody actually was able to prove the identity of Shakespeare and actually come across a draft of Hamlet written in Shakespeare's own hand. People would just go nuts because Shakespeare is as famous as Shakespeare is, there's hardly anything that's truly known about him. And I just think that's sort of this confirmation bias that people just wanted it to be the truth so badly. But let me just ask you, and I know last question on this, I know you're not an art historian, but what is the thing or a thing that makes you say probably not a Leonardo?
Again, it's a gut feeling. I look at it and it doesn't strike me emotionally the same way that many of his paintings do. Also, he didn't frequently paint men.
Interesting.
Most of his most famous works are centered on female figures. That is something I had fun playing with in the scope of my novel. But I also, we were talking about this a bit before the show, but there's not a lot of surrounding paper trail, if you will, around him working on a piece like this. And I think that is very suspect because we have a tremendous wealth of information from Leonardo's notebooks, from surviving commissions, from other people writing letters about what they saw visiting Leonardo's workshop, or even by rumor. And from my limited knowledge on the subject, it doesn't seem like that same wealth of paper trail supports the provenance that is argued for Salvator Mundi. And it's interesting because we have these documentary details for paintings that perhaps have not survived by Leonardo. one that comes up in the book is, he seemed to have worked on a Saint Sebastian at one point. And there is a surviving preparatory sketch for that also went for an obscene amount of money in a private auction within the last 10, 20 years, which makes me sad because we can't see it in a museum. But it is interesting to consider, if there were these works that we know he was working on from his notebooks, from letters, why is the Salvator Mundi not one that is as heavily documented?
Right, exactly. You mentioned a moment ago, you said it doesn't make you feel like the other ones make you feel. And I know that's not scientific, but I think it is like super important, and maybe even might even be kind of as important as a more kind of documented reason for rejecting it as a Leonardo. Tell me what that feeling is. Like what is the way you feel when you see a real Leonardo?
I mean, it is a unique experience. I'm lucky to be sitting in London right now, where I live, and there's a Leonardo at the National Gallery here, and it's a 20-minute train ride away from me. And some days I just go in because it's admissions free, which is a real privilege. And just to sit there and look at these works, and for me, it's it's the detail, it's the eyes. I think there's a real emotionality to how he rendered facial expressions, and especially the eyes, but also just the detail and the anatomy that he applied to everything. Also at the National Gallery in London, there is a painting that is attributed to Andrea del Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's master, whom he apprenticed under. And it is widely speculated, and this one I agree with, that Leonardo painted a fish within that painting. And if you go and look at that painting in the museum, it's very small, so you have to get really close to it.
Yeah.
And very few people are looking at it in the gallery because it's not labeled as a Leonardo. But if you look at it, it's a interesting enough painting. There are some lazy details in there. There's a hand posture that's repeated twice. But then you look at this fish, and it's just so immediately apparent that it's done by a different hand. The way that the individual scales are shining, the dead-eyed stare of the fish on, hanging from the string, a little drop of blood from the belly. It's those sorts of details that I am searching for in the Salvator Mundi, and I don't see personally, but I also haven't seen it in person, unfortunately.
Right. And who knows when we'll see it. I guess MBS is like planning some museum in the desert to try to attract people to Saudi Arabia, and maybe it will be shown there. It's funny, in the comments right now, I see Robin making a comment that maybe Leonardo was going through something at the time, and that's why it looked a little different. I love that comment, like stir the controversy.
Yes.
One other thing about the feeling of a Leonardo painting, there was a wonderful comment that really stuck with me that just was kind of a throwaway comment in the Lost Leonardo film, where somebody was discussing Leonardo's style and kind of answering a similar question that you just answered, which is like, how do you know it's not him? And the person said that they described Leonardo's style as assertive but ambiguous. And I just no, I can't wait to find out why you're laughing. But like, to me, that was like, it was such an interesting comment, because I just feel like that's so Leonardo. He is so brilliant and so confident. He knows he's the best, right? And so there's the assertive part, right? But then ambiguous is like, he just also doesn't quite believe in art maybe as like the true vehicle to capture what he's after. And so he's just ambivalent. He's unsure. He almost doesn't quite care. Like, I feel like when Michelangelo is painting, he cares. And he's like, I want you to love it and see how beautiful this is, right? And Leonardo is like, just kind of on a different level. And like, just, I know I'm a genius at this, but also I've got bigger fish to fry almost. What's your response?
I might disagree with you on the caring bit. I think maybe he cared too much, might be my take on it, but also couldn't execute to his internal vision. And I think the reason I laughed is because it feels entirely apt to use a contradiction to explain Leonardo's style, because he is a constant contradiction. But beyond that, I think it is that quality of, you said it well, he is so talented, and he knew he was talented, and he knew he was operating at a level far different from his peers. But I think, yes, there is that frustration with the limits as to what is in his mind versus what he can get on the panel. And then there's also, I think you're onto an interesting idea of thinking about him questioning whether painting is the right medium for what he's trying to accomplish. And I think that's why we get this incredible, I would say like almost photorealism to his style, but then some very curious choices in terms of the staging of the figures, or the symbolism within the paintings, or the way that someone is looking. I'm thinking of the lady with the ermine right now.
I know that painting. I love that painting.
Yeah, it's incredible. That was the one that was disappointing not to be able to write about in the context of FLORENZER, because that came later. It's those curious choices that I think really define him.
And thank you for correcting that, like that he cared too much. I do
I'm not correcting. Your opinion's valid on that.
No, but just to clarify, when I said like he didn't care, what I meant more was like he didn't care about using painting to kind of like, impress his donor, or like get another painting commission, or like use it for like the typical ways that the common consumer of art might want the art to just like look pretty like a Botticelli, but he was just after something so much greater. Like he wanted painting to almost be more than what it was. That's sort of what I meant about not caring about that aspect of painting.
And I think that is entirely true, that the idea of commissions was deeply uninspiring to him.
Yep. All right. So another really interesting aspect about this time is sort of, you have this incredible time in Florence in the late 1400s. And, we haven't really gotten into it, but, your book has, a son of the Medici family. You have a priest, the Pope is involved. There's an assassination attempt. There is just action. It's gritty. It's a very kind of violent and dangerous story in a lot of ways. And we haven't even touched on all of that, just because because I selfishly, this is my show and I just want to talk about Leonardo so much. But trust me, folks, there is so much more to this book than just Leonardo. But another question that I just can't help but ask you is just about, it is about the nature of genius. And it's about, why do certain places and times generate a kind of outsized amount of, quote, geniuses in a certain field? So here's some examples. In Paris in the 1920s, you had a bunch of great writers like Hemingway and Joyce. I mean, Picasso was there in that time. You had Vienna around 1800. You had Beethoven and Mozart. You had Athens, Greece in 350 BC, where you had Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Euripides. You had Hollywood in the 70s and 80s, when you had Coppola and Lucas and Spielberg. They're all friends with each other, making films and revolutionizing film. And then, you could even say in the 60s in music, you had Dylan and the Beatles, and the kind of, and the Rolling Stones, and the kind of music that was made then was so revolutionary and sort of hasn't been surpassed, arguably, since. So why is it, the question is, like in these certain places, in certain like years, there's just all of us, like, why wouldn't there also have been a great painter in Vienna in 1800? Why wouldn't there have been a great novelist in the 60s in New York City, right? I mean, but it's just a concentration of a certain kind of genius. So this like tees up a question here, which is like, I think there's a view of genius that like, it's just, you're born with it. It's in your genes. There's nothing to be done about it. Some people are geniuses or some are not. But if you look at kind of what I just laid out, it's sort of suggesting something else, which is that there's something going on in the surroundings and in the kind of the spiritus mundi, to borrow that phrase, like the kind of the zeitgeist that like is bringing forth a certain kind of genius. So what do you think about all of that?
I think it's a really interesting idea how, as you described, these moments recur across history. And I agree. I don't think it's an interesting question to wonder whether Leonardo would have been the Leonardo that we know him as today had he arrived 100 years earlier or 100 years later.
Right.
And I'd be inclined to say he wouldn't have been the same. That
he would
yes,
have, yes.
the individual needs that innate curiosity and needs that original vision, but that needs to coincide and perhaps collide and build from, ferment with the the air of a place, if for lack of a better word. I think it's interesting that you mentioned cities in your examples, because I do think cities, when they work, capture this well at particular moments of being magnets for people, drawing people from disparate backgrounds and different statuses as well. I think that's the interesting thing with Leonardo. He's coming from, he's a bastard. He's attracted to other men, but there are also many people in Florence at the time who are attracted to men, and many of them, Botticelli, Michelangelo, go on to be these great artists. And so I do think there is something about cities drawing these characters in. And I also think there is an aspect to this, and unfortunately, I don't want to say this, but I think money's a part of it too. That cities are often, concentrations of wealth. This isn't true across all the examples that you mentioned, but I do think there is an attitude of cities fostering creativity, especially, amongst both privileged and disenfranchised people, but then there being a willingness on an institutional level and frankly, a monetary level to support artists. And so it is folks like Hemingway getting, magazine commissions in Paris during the 1920s. It is, the Beatles getting signed in England in the 60s. And so I think that's a part of it, unfortunately, is, I think you mentioned the comment of like, oh, why weren't there, any, why aren't we looking at New York 60s for writers? Why are we looking at it for music or counterculture? I think the writers were there, but maybe just not at the right moment of getting the support in terms of finance, in terms of publicity, connections to raise them up to be a part of like this singular moment.
Yeah. So I misspoke earlier. So you were saying, I was paraphrasing, but I think what you did say was that Leonardo would not have been Leonardo 100 years before, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, you don't think so? Which is just like a totally fascinating thing to think about. I mean, I think when you really let that sit with you and you think that like these people who were called the great, geniuses of history, like had they not been in a certain place in a certain time, would not have become who they were. And I think it's an interesting thing. I'm just thinking of this on the spot, but it's like when you like carry that over to something like, say, politics, or say global exploration, right? I mean, like, would Magellan have been Magellan 500 years later? Obviously not. Like, would Napoleon have been Napoleon had he grown up in a liberal democratic society and like been born in San Francisco in 1970? No, of course not. Like, I mean, when you see people who like really had to do things in the world that were not like primarily mental, that had to do with the world, obviously it's how the world was physically around them and the power structures around them that made it possible. But when it comes to kind of more mental, spiritual, artistic things, I think I anyway have a feeling like, oh, well, that would have just, because it's an internal thing, it would have just come out of them no matter what. But it's like sort of what we're saying here is that it's no different than, a Columbus or a Magellan or a Caesar who like sort of were at a certain place where something was possible. Artistically, it's just the same thing. There's also an opportunity that only existed right at that time for an artistic thing to be expressed.
Exactly. And I think that's where the Renaissance is unique, because we see like an entire revolution in how painting is done. And if Leonardo wasn't able to be walking around Florence and going into chapels and seeing work by Alberti, seeing, Brunelleschi's dome, these, he would not have painted the same way that he ended up painting. Like it is conditional on, his forefathers and, ancestors in that regard.
Yeah. So I do agree with what you said, that money is the key. And, money I mean, it's obviously important to kind of finance things and encourage people, but it also, money is just an expression also of the zeitgeist, right? Like
Mhm.
the money sort of flows where the people are interested, and why are they interested in a certain art form or a certain thing at a certain time? Who knows? It's a complicated question, but I just think that it's interesting to use that as a pivot into a conversation briefly about Hollywood, where, you know, I mean, Hollywood is a rapidly changing place. I mean, sort of Hollywood as kind of like an industry is not geographically located really in Hollywood anymore, like less and less as the days go by. But Hollywood is a thing that, you know, I think it's one of the great American exports is our entertainment. Clearly, it's a thing that does have a lot of money and prestige in America. And I think that a lot, I mean, history, I think, will probably show that like a lot of great minds and a lot of great storytelling came out of Hollywood. My question to you, as somebody who kind of worked in Hollywood, is just, I am interested in storytelling, and I'm always interested in this question of like, why do certain stories get told, and are the best stories getting told, and are they being told in the best way? And I just want to put that to you, just kind of about Hollywood. Like, is Hollywood a place for great storytelling, and why or why not?
Not right now is
Yeah.
my hot take.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I think it's a very risk averse
Mm,
industry at the moment. It is because it is first and foremost an industry, and that
mhm.
has always been true. But you know, you highlighted the '70s with Coppola, with Spielberg, with Lucas.
Yeah.
Um, that you know, those days of experimentation are not today.
Mm,
And that's not to say there aren't excellent films being made, and
mm,
you know, even films coming out of Hollywood,
mhm,
you know, are you know still excellent. But
mm,
um, I don't think the most interesting stories are being told right now in Hollywood. I think we're seeing a lot
mm,
of, unfortunately, IP mining done sometimes in interesting ways, but not necessarily starting with an interesting idea, rather just finding interesting executions of stuff that's, you know, already been optioned and or, you know, in the open domain or a part of a studio's existing IP
mhm,
collection.
mhm,
But you know, I this is where I have to reveal that I do, you know, I the first version of Florenzer I wrote very different, but was a screenplay and not a novel.
mm.
Um, I studied, you know, I focused on screenwriting when I went to film school for my undergrad at NYU, and that was when I wrote this first draft of a historical period drama set during Renaissance Florence involving the Medici. Leonardo was not in that pilot. And yes, I would still love there to be some sort of TV version of what I wrote, certainly. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to say no to that, but I think I had to turn to the novel because I knew pretty instantly, like, this is not going to get made right now. And you know where the industry's interests are, you know, perhaps not with period, and you know, certainly the novel opens up new opportunities with interiority that I think was essential in terms of exploring a painter and artist's source of inspiration.
Oh my God. And the language is so great. I mean, the first thought that I have when I hear that this is a screenplay, was a screenplay originally, is that what a loss that would have been to all the great language and writing in
Oh,
the
thank
book.
you.
Yeah, you write really beautifully. What do you think that Hollywood gets right about storytelling that specifically novelists are not good at, or novelists ought to learn something from Hollywood?
Dialogue. I will bump in a book when I come across language that
Mm,
just doesn't feel like how humans actually talk, and that can be a
mhm,
valid choice by an author,
mhm,
but I think if you are trying to write in a contemporary way with contemporary figures, we should, my personal opinion is, be writing the way that people talk. And
mhm,
that doesn't mean just inserting a bunch of ums, likes, filler
mhm,
words. It is about a sense of incompleteness to how folks communicate when they are speaking off the cuff. We don't sound entirely polished when we are
mhm.
having a dialogue. Right now, I would sound much better if I could just script this on my computer.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, And I think that's where the magic of dialogue is, and Hollywood does get that right. And I think Hollywood also gets right story structure. I do, I love a character-centric plot-light novel, but I do think there are a lot of novels I've read that would have benefited from understanding, our long-standing expectations with narrative arc.
Yeah.
And sometimes I do find myself 100 pages into a book and, I'm just like, where's the inciting incident?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I was just watching a film by I won't name the film, but it's by a director that I really respect and who I think is doing interesting things. But it was a film that was like very much would be called a character study, and you see this all the time in novels as well. But my thought that's relevant to this that occurred to me when I was watching that, I was like, just because something has a great story and is exciting and engaging and has a plot doesn't mean that it's not also a character study. I mean, like look at Shakespeare. I mean, the thing about Shakespeare is like those plays are like 20,000 words long. I mean, basically about like 1/5 or less of the length of a normal novel, right? And you have multiple character arcs. It's all a character study. I mean, you can have a character arc from a character who like appears in like 5 scenes and has 1 line per scene, but he's on some kind of arc and he learns something in the end and he's different at the beginning than at the end than he was at the beginning. I mean, just having characters develop and saying interesting things about people is not mutually exclusive with telling an exciting story. Yeah. So anyway, I also am like big on story structure, as everybody who watches the show knows. And I do get frustrated when it's a little bit slack. All right, let's do a couple audience questions before we wrap here. Phil, do you paint, draw, and sculpt as well?
No, I wish I did. I did actually have my first foray into painting when I was writing the novel. I figured if I'm writing about painting, I need to know what the feeling is like. And luckily, there is a gorgeous pigment shop in London with many of the historic pigments in stock. And I quickly learned many of them are toxic by today's standards. And so you can't breathe while you are doing said painting. But even learning something like that was fascinating. And so by personal practice, I do not paint, but I certainly exposed myself to it while writing the novel.
All right, let's take one more. Do you think it took Leonardo longer to become popular due to all of his varied interests? Like he just kind of was so all over the place that is why maybe he didn't rise up like, say, a Botticelli.
I think this is a great question, and I think it's a firm yes from me on it. I think his innate curiosity, but one could also label that as distractedness, oftentimes led him away from finishing a work efficiently, or it often got him hung up on an aspect of a work that its eventual owner, buyer would not have cared about. And so, folks like Botticelli are churning out 6+ paintings in a year. It's a good year for Leonardo if he finishes a painting in the single year.
Yeah. I asked you this in the interview we did last time, but I didn't get to ask you it this time, but I'll ask it now. Did you ever feel like you were not up to the task as a writer of bringing to life on page someone of such stature and genius as Leonardo?
Constantly. I was hesitant to start writing about Leonardo. I started writing and I was second guessing myself. Even up till the novel's release, maybe, and I think some part of me still holds on to a bit of this. It does feel like I am taking a very amateur attempt.
Don't say that. No, it's not amateur. This is a great book.
I appreciate that, but compared to someone of that stature, it is quite humbling, which I think is actually quite a good thing for an artist to go through. But I also think what eventually allowed me on some days to move past this thinking is that Leonardo was constantly failing. He didn't finish most of his works. He leaves so many commissions unfinished. He's behind payment. He's getting hassled by the Signoria of Florence. His dad's complaining about the fact that he hasn't finished something. he was he messed things up quite regularly. And so as much as we laud him as a genius, I think maybe we were both feeling the same things centuries apart, if I can be so bold as.
No, but I mean, honestly, that's sort of like, that was sort of the provenance, if you will, of this question, which is that I am curious. One interesting thing about writing about Leonardo is that I wonder how it made you feel. Not just can you execute it? You just answered that question, but more like, I mean, just surrounded constantly by somebody who is so, had such a kind of mind as in all the ways that we've talked about. Like, did it ever make you feel like, God, why do I even bother as an artist myself? And so, but a little bit of like, you sort of felt like you're relating to him a little bit. I mean, I guess my question is just sort of on the net, did you feel like it made you want to make more art and made you hopeful in your own Phil Melanson artistic quest? Or did it make you feel like, ugh, why bother even trying? I'll never be anything like this, so it's just not worth it. Like, where were you on that spectrum?
I oscillated, certainly, but I think I ended up on the former end of it, where, ultimately I am very lucky to have finished a novel and have it out in the world right now, and, have it here in my hands next to me. And that is maybe the thing that drives me to keep writing. And certainly I'm doing that. And, I hope Leonardo felt that way, but he finished very few paintings. So that might explain a lot of the frustration that is in his notebooks.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, I always wrap my interviews with the same question, which is, if you imagine the ideal reader for Florenzer, imagine that they have just kind of gotten it in just the way you'd hope somebody would get it in their wildest dreams. And this ideal reader finishes the book, closes it, puts it on their lap. What, in a phrase or even a word, what is this reader feeling?
Curious is something, I want them to be feeling. I think I want them to want to learn more. I am showing you a specific shaft of light on a very murky time in history. And I would love people to continue exploring. And I mean, both in fiction, Maggie O'Farrell, we mentioned her earlier. She wrote a great novel about the Medici family, essentially 2 generations after my novel's Medici family. You could go there, but you could also, of course, go to the intense and deep well and wealth of scholarship that's available on the Renaissance, and great documentaries like The Lost Leonardo or the Ken Burns.
Oh my God.
But I think want them to be questioning. I think it was a learning process for me writing this book, of really recontextualizing and reimagining the way I look at this specific period in time. And, as a queer writer, what that queerness looks like 500 years ago. And so my hope would be that a reader also considers what aspects of history are too often being elided by the scholarship that we have decided is sacrosanct for whatever reason.
Wonderful. Oh, so great, Phil. Well, folks, we put a link to buy the book in the chat. It's Florenzer by Phil Melanson. It's a wonderful book. Phil, do you have another book that's, kind of on its way, or?
I do. I am drafting it right now. So it's going to be different in possibly every conceivable way from Florenzer. It's contemporary. It's, first person. It's in LA. So expect something wildly different, but also know that I still want to write more historical novels as well.
Hey, you're not a one-trick pony, Phil.
Try not to be.
All right. Hey, everybody, thanks for all the great questions. Sorry I didn't get to everything, but this has been wonderful. Appreciate all of you coming out. And Phil, congratulations on the book. It's terrific.
Thanks so much, Mark. It was great chatting with you.
All right, folks. We'll see you next time on Thoughtful Bro.